Hello, friends. This is a message that is intended for November 14, and it is entitled In Search of Godly Wisdom. And I'm going to make this a little two-part, little small mini series. I want to start by sharing a little bit about why this topic. So a couple things. One is in prayer meeting on Wednesday evenings, our Bible study time has been through the book of Ecclesiastes. And I have really enjoyed going through this book and studying it together in a small group. And a lot of it is on the topic of life. And recently, as we've studied chapter 7, it's been talking about wisdom. And it's interesting how Ecclesiastes is kind of a search for meaning of life by Solomon. And it's a search going down different pathways in his own endeavors to find meaning and purpose in life and satisfaction. And then the book of Proverbs is kind of a godly search where Solomon realizes and recognizes at that point in his life that the meaning of life comes through God. And so with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about wisdom. And then also, I have some decisions that I'm making. I've been asking God for wisdom. And last night, we had a board meeting that we called dealing with reopening of our church. And it was interesting because the discussion was about should we reopen concerning with the safety issues. We had made plans and we were all ready to reopen. And it was divided in the discussion, great discussion. Both sides had great points. We're ready to open. We should open. The other side, well, with the increase in the kind of the spike in the COVID cases, that maybe it would be wise for us to be a little more patient and wait. What was interesting to me is that it was so close. Like we took a vote, a little straw vote at first, and it was really close. And then eventually we decided, let's have a word of prayer. So we had a couple of us pray, and we were claiming that promise that's found in James that that we should ask for wisdom, and that God loves to give us his wisdom, and he will give it freely to us. And so we did that. And maybe you've been in meetings where it's kind of a stalemate, and everybody wants to do the right thing, and you're just not sure what to do, and you just really need the wisdom of God. And so you just pause. You say, wait a minute, let's just pray together. So that's what we did. And after the prayer, I'm smiling because I was trying to remember if this has ever happened in our board meetings previously. It was within one vote. And we made the decision to postpone and wait a little bit longer, but it was so close. And here we were praying for the wisdom of God, and I was leaning one way, and then after prayer and listening to others' points, I then started to actually lean a different way. And it was just, there's times in your life where you're just searching for the wisdom of God. And so I want to talk about what God has been, I guess, in my own life experience right now, what God is teaching me and leading me to have better understanding on. And it's just really practical in my life, and maybe some of you right now also. It just is great timing for you as you think about, man, I have a strong desire to have the wisdom of God in every area. Maybe not just in a decision you're making, but in the way that I see life. I want the wisdom of God in my life. So the verse that I want to use today is from Proverbs chapter 4, verse 7. And here's what Solomon says. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Though it costs all you have, get understanding. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what is wisdom and what wisdom is not. Let me start with what wisdom is not. Wisdom is not intelligence. It's not the score that you receive on an IQ test. It's not even your brain power. I'm talking today in this message about godly wisdom. It's not even common sense. It can lead you to these things. It's not simply having great knowledge. It's not about having great credentials or letters or initials after your name or carved on your nameplate on your desk or on your door at work. It's not even the levels of education or the number of degrees that you have. Wisdom is something far different than what the Bible describes. And I've been trying to come up with my own definition of wisdom. I've read a lot of really good ones, and I've tried to make it really condensed and so that I can remember it and recite it and remind myself as often as I can. So here's what I've boiled it down to. I'm going to try to convince us of this in this message and then the second part that will be next week. So I'm going to define wisdom as seeing the issues of life through God's lens. So seeing others the way God sees others, my neighbor, my spouse, my kids. Like, I want to be able to see people around me the way God sees them. I want to be able to see my workplace and my work environment, the people that I work with. How does God see my work, my profession, my occupation, whatever my hand finds to do? How does God see it? How does God view maybe it's the folks that I work with, or maybe a boss or an employer I might have, or in the way in which I'm diligent, and the way that I fulfill responsibilities. Like, how does God see my work? How does God see me, like myself, ourselves? Because I think that's a great question, is how does God see me? What is his view upon me in my life? And I hope that the majority of that view, if not all of that view, but the vast majority, is very positive and very affirming how God sees us. And then just in general, the issues of life. As we go throughout life, we make thousands of decisions. We make, we see things and we come to conclusions, and some of them are assumptions. How do we see the issues of life? To me, godly wisdom, the best definition I have at this moment, currently, is that it's to see life, the issues of life, through God's lens, through God's perspective, through God's view. And today, what I want to focus on is the challenges of having God's wisdom. And then next week, I want to talk about the steps that we can take to actually receive wisdom of God, God's wisdom. So first, I wanted to provide the setting and the backdrop and the difficulties, the challenges. And I'm going to boil it down to 4 things of why it sounds easy to just receive the wisdom of God, but I actually find that there's 4 major challenges. There's others that I could think of, but I just wanted to focus on the 4 that I think are the major challenges of why we struggle with godly wisdom. So the first one is that godly wisdom does not come naturally to us. And I love Proverbs chapter 3. This is probably some of your favorites as well. Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he, God, shall direct your paths." And the part in that verse that I have really been thinking about, those verses are awesome, but the part that's been on my mind is where it says, don't lean on your own understanding. You see, one of the challenges that we have of receiving godly wisdom is that we often think that we're pretty smart and we're pretty wise ourselves. I mean, we wouldn't come out and say that we're smart and wise, but it seems like at times, at least for myself, that I lean more upon maybe a checklist or a list that I can make of pros and cons, or putting my thoughts together and having good common sense. Good common sense, God's wisdom may lead to that, but you can have good common sense and not have godly wisdom. And so the thing that I'm trying to remind myself of is to start with that first challenge, that it doesn't come naturally. I'm not born. In fact, I'm born with a bent towards evil. I'm born to rely upon myself. And we see that with Adam and Eve, when sin entered the Garden of Eden through their disobedience, that they tried to solve the sin problem themselves. We'll sew fig leaves and make our own clothing to hide our nakedness. But God had a better solution, in fact, the only solution. And so I want to start off with that challenge of it does not come naturally, because we think that we are wise and we think that we are pretty smart. We think that we can handle our own problems and that we can work things out. So I wanted to start with that one. The second part that I wanted to mention to the challenge is that we have a part to play. And what I mean by that is the challenge is that we have to search for it. It not only does not come naturally, but it involves us, our passion to search after. In fact, Solomon in Proverbs chapter 2, verse 4, he says, in speaking about wisdom, he says that we need to search for it as if searching for hidden treasure. And then he says, following that, speaking about wisdom, right? And he says, and search for her as for hidden treasure, if you seek her as silver, the first part of that verse says. So if I knew that there was some silver hidden in the Tri-Cities and I had a map, I mean, I can remember as kids, and imagining treasure hunts and those kinds of things. And so when I think about the challenge that we have is that it's not going to just simply come upon us. We have to actually search for it. We have to desire it. We have to look for it. And I'll talk a little bit next week about how the Word of God is such an important ingredient in our search. Where do we go to discover wisdom? What's this searching part? So that's the second challenge that I see, is that we have to search for it. The third thing is that godly wisdom is the opposite of worldly wisdom. And so that creates quite a challenge for us, because we have voices around us. We have teachers around us. We have philosophers. We have schools around us. We have a lot of things that we have on, whether it's on the internet and other, like voices that are screaming to us that this is wise. You should act this way towards your boss. You should treat your wife this way. This is how you should do this or that. Like, it tells us how the world thinks we should live. And yet I realize that godly wisdom is actually the exact opposite of worldly wisdom. And Solomon is the great example of that. It's hard for me to imagine how the wisest man, if you ask the Bible question, the trivia question, who is the wisest man in the Bible that lived, Solomon is that answer that we give. Remember, he was given that gift of wisdom. And yet, when you look at Solomon and his life, he really struggled. It also tells me that you can have wisdom one moment and not have it later at another moment. And I think we'll discover that more a little bit later, is that it comes with God. And when you don't have God in your life, then you lose that wisdom, that godly perspective that he wants to give us. Solomon, I mentioned before, we've been studying Ecclesiastes. We were studying chapter 7 just a couple nights ago. And it's interesting because Solomon, even in chapter 7, he talks about how he searched for wisdom on his own. And he, in verse 23, says, I was tested by this wisdom, and I said, I'm determined to be wise, but this was beyond me. So Solomon admits that he searched much of his life for a lot of different ways to find out the meaning of life, satisfaction of life. He searched science and nature. Ecclesiastes 1 talks about, if you go through the first 6 chapters, he searched wisdom and philosophy. He went even through pleasure. He searched for satisfaction and meaning, life, and wealth. He searched even religious activity and morality is one of the things that he went down that pathway searching. And yet his conclusion is that it's all meaningless. Like the first six chapters of Ecclesiastes are kind of this conclusion that, man, everything under the sun is just meaningless. It's pointless. And then in chapter 7, he starts with kind of these proverbs as he reflects on life through his own human wisdom. He starts to give some proverbs and some narration of some thoughts that he has in the last 6 chapters. And so the life of Solomon is a great example of how, man, if you don't search for it and realize that we have a part to play, that you can have it one moment and might not have it at another time. And we did recently, I shared a 2-part series entitled Satisfied. And remember, the conclusion that I was trying to present in those 2 messages was that in regards to your life course and even your life's final destination, if God is absent from your journey, that you will never, ever be completely satisfied. And I think Solomon's life is the perfect example of that very thing. He found that to be true. So the opposite of godly wisdom, of worldly wisdom and godly wisdom, they're at 2 polar extremes. They actually oppose one another often. And I'm reminded of what the Apostle Paul has to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 18. Remember, he talks about the wisdom of the world, the wisdom of the wise, and then he contrasts that with the wisdom of God. But let me just read a little bit of this. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed, Jews ask for signs, and Greeks, they search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified to Jews, a stumbling block, and to Gentiles, foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jew and Greek, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than man. Wow, those are powerful words contrasting the wisdom of the world and that seems to be foolishness when you talk about the wisdom of God, at least in the world's perspective. And then the last challenge that I wanted to talk about is that we have poor vision. And let me try to set that up. So there's a lot of factors that greatly influence our poor eyesight. In fact, Solomon, again, is a great example of that. We were studying chapter 7, as I mentioned. And, Solomon, as he's going through, you can tell that the wisdom that he's sharing with us, and he has, interesting things, to share. He talks about the value of a good reputation. He says there's honor, that honor is better than luxury, that your day of death is better than the day of your birth. He says it's better to be at a funeral than it is to be at a party. I mean, he has it kind of sounds strange as you start to study it, but you got to remember, this is Solomon through his own eyes trying to view what wisdom is. Where the book of Proverbs is, you can see the influence of God's Spirit, that it's through God's eyes. It's wisdom, the book of Proverbs, through God's eyes. So as you get down in chapter 7, you can see that Solomon has poor eyesight also. He starts talking about women. You remember some of the things that he says about women. He talks about let me start in verse 26. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. Look, says the teacher, this is what I've discovered. Adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things, while I was still searching but not finding, I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. And you look at that verse and you're thinking, now wait a minute. I mean, is Solomon given like a universal statement about women? Like, you can't, in the search on earth, you can't find but you might find one upright man. So the point I want to make in this is that the vision of Solomon is skewed and biased based on his own experience, right? Solomon's the one that had the 300 wives, the 700 concubines. You remember in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4, what it says about Solomon? It says, for when Solomon was old, this is probably when he's writing Ecclesiastes, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to God as the heart of David his father had been. So his wives, the women around him in his life, the writer of Kings says that, look, they actually led him away after other gods. So you can see that the experience of Solomon, because my experience has been the quite opposite. Godly mother, godly wife, godly sisters, like I have been treated loving, kind, respectful, caring by the women that's been the most influential in my life. So there's no way that in my own wisdom that I would ever say, oh, I can't find one upright woman among all my traipsing across the earth. So the point is that our vision gets skewed based on a lot of different things. And one of those things has to do with our family, has to do with our culture, has to do with our experiences that we have in life. Those end up giving us a bias or a leaning towards a certain view. So I'm going to try to wrap this part up by using an illustration about our vision, because I've used similar illustrations and I cannot think of a better illustration. I remind myself of this very often and to help prove this point, that the vision that we have is actually very poor. So let's imagine that little parable. Let's imagine that I go to bed last night, and as I always do, I take off my glasses. And those of you that don't wear glasses, just try to come along with me on this little parable. And so I take off my glasses, and I have this little case that I keep my glasses in to keep them from getting scratched. I don't know how they still get scratched, but that's another question. So go to bed, go to sleep. In the night, in the middle of the night, an enemy comes into my house, sneaks into my bedroom, grabs my glasses out of their case, and proceeds to replace them with another pair of glasses. Now, the other pair of glasses that replaces them with, they look identical, same identical frames, but they have different lenses. So the lenses that they've been replaced with is, you know how when you go to the optometrist, if you've ever sat in one of those, I don't even know what those machines are called, but they do this click, this eye this way, click, is this better or worse? Click, is this one better or worse? And let's just say that the new glasses that this enemy has put in my glass case is just 1 or 2 clicks off from having 20/20 vision. So I wake up, right, in the morning, and I go throughout my day unaware that my vision has been altered because the lenses have been changed in my glasses. And I'm now viewing the world through a completely skewed, inaccurate vision, right? Like I'm not seeing, things are not completely in focus, and they are actually distorted with this other pair of glasses. And so the challenges that I go throughout the day, I might not even be aware of. I might not even be aware that I'm not really seeing things as clearly as I think I am. And so I go ahead and I journey throughout the day, make thousands of decisions. We make thousands of decisions, small ones, most of them, throughout each day. And so I was thinking about in this illustration that the problem that we have with godly wisdom is that the wisdom, the way in which we see the world, the way we see ourselves, the way we see others around us, the way we see our church, the way we see politics, the way we see everything, right? Like we see it through our lens. And God is trying to say, no, wait a minute, there's some challenges that you have when it comes to having my wisdom given to you. It doesn't come naturally. You're going to have to actually search for it. You're going to have a passion and a dedication to search as if you were searching for silver or hidden treasure. And that this biblical, godly wisdom that I want to give you, it's actually opposite of what you're hearing from the world. And here's the fourth problem. You have poor vision. You have a vision that is not accurate. You're looking through a lens that is distorted by humanity, by the fallen, corrupted nature that we have, right? Like this sinful, corrupted, influenced by many factors, the lens that we have. And wisdom is getting a new lens from God. And I go, because I have type 2 diabetes, I have to go and get my eyes checked every year, pictures taken of them. I'm not suggesting once a year that we spiritually need new glasses. I'm suggesting daily that we need new glasses. Like when the Apostle Paul talks about the renewing of our minds daily, I think this is what he's talking about. Like we need God. We need to be able to wake up and say, God, I need a new pair of glasses today. I want to be able to see the world around me as you see them. I'm fascinated. I love studying the books of Daniel and Revelation. And I'll close with this. In Revelation 3, remember the messages to the 7 churches? And as we study that, we see a parallel with certain times of church history in relation to the 7 churches that were actually in existence during the time of John's writing. When you get down to the 7th church, we've always seen the church of Laodicea as being that last generation, that last community of faith, if you will, that last church alive just before the second coming of Jesus. So we've always paid special attention because we believe our generation is portrayed in that message to the church of Laodicea. And you remember that in that message, the church of Laodicea starts off that they're portrayed as being lukewarm and how God wants to vomit them, spew them out of their mouth. He wishes they were hot or cold. But do you remember after that part when their problem is described? Do you remember what the problem is that they have? This is in Revelation chapter 3, and I'm in verse 17. You say, I am rich. I have acquired wealth and do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you're actually wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. That's 5 characteristics that God sees from his view of the last generation church. So what was their problem? Well, the problem is, they have a self, reliance problem. But their overall problem is they have a vision problem. They have a sight problem. They see themselves completely different than they actually are. They think that we're fine, we're wealthy, we don't need a thing, and yet you've got all these 5 conditions, right? You're pitiful, blind, naked, wretched, poor. So they have a sight problem. They think they're all right. The mirror that they're looking at, if they're even looking in the mirror, says, I'm all right. They have a vision problem. And what is the counsel that God gives to this last day church that's lukewarm, that thinks that everything's fine and that they're okay? I counsel you to buy me 3 things. First, buy from me gold refined in fire so you can become rich. We could do a little Bible study on the beauty of that message. The second component, white clothes. Like, I want to clothe you. You need new clothes to cover your shameful nakedness. That's number 2. But do you remember the last thing that God says the church needs? You need salve, you need ointment to put on your eyes so you can see. And what I'm suggesting to us today, to me today, as I'm seeking the wisdom of God, is that if I want to see the way God sees, if I want to have the lens of God, if I want to have the perspective of God, not just in making decisions, but in the issues of life, then I need a new vision. I need to give God permission. I need to seek in God's word. I need to have, and we'll talk more about this in the steps next week, but God wants to give me his wisdom. He wants to give me his view of heaven and earth, the issues of heaven, the issues of earth. And so my challenge for myself this week, and let me just give it as a challenge, kind of a charge from me, Pastor Greg, to you, is how about when you start your day, when you get up in the morning, to give God permission to give you new lenses. Just think of that, even if you don't wear glasses, just think of the analogy that give God permission to give you his glasses, his lens, to be able to see your world today. Ask God to give you his eye salve so that we can clearly see others, so we can clearly see God, so that we can clearly see ourselves. And if not with pinpoint precision, at least pray that God would give us greater vision than we had yesterday, right? So I desire godly wisdom. And I know there's challenges around us and why it is difficult to receive and to gain the wisdom of God. But I know that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. Right? That's Proverbs 1. And I want wisdom. I desire wisdom. I want the vision of God and the perspective of God. And so I challenge you to start your day off with acknowledging that God is the creator. I am not. I'm the creation. He is wise. I am not. His ways are best, not my ways. I'm not going to lean on my own understanding. What is godly wisdom? Seeing the issues of life through God's lens. Next week, we will look at more of godly wisdom and the steps So now that we've uncovered kind of the challenges, what are some of those steps that we can take to receive and to gain the wisdom of God? Blessings in you throughout this day and also throughout your upcoming week as you give God permission to give you his vision for heaven and earth.